Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on integrating with Salesforce. So we are ready to get started with today's session. This is Integrating Salesforce, an overview. And my name is Peter Chittum, as you can see on the picture there. I'm the Director of Developer Evangelism here in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I am based out of the UK, which is where I am today. Although I don't sound like it. I do work for Salesforce. I've worked for Salesforce for the past 6 years, first in what was then called Training and Certification, and now Salesforce University as a developer instructor, and now in the developer relations team. My Twitter handle is @pchittum. Please follow me. I'd love it if you would. I'm ever so close to 2,000, so let's see, maybe we can put it over 2,000 today. All right, now of course we start every Salesforce presentation with this slide, our forward-looking statement slide. Just be aware I may talk about features that are currently not generally available in the product, and if I do, don't make any purchasing decisions based on those features. Only purchase based on features that are currently available and in production for Salesforce. We are a social company, and business is social. So please be sure to check us out on our social channels, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. Apart from Twitter, those are all Salesforce developers, and on Twitter, either Salesforce Devs or #ForceWebinar. Like we said, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll post it to YouTube afterward. As we said, don't wait to ask questions until the end. Ask them now in the questions window. We will answer any tech support questions immediately, but we will answer any product questions during the Q&A at the end. Please don't repeat questions. If you do have a question, just have a little scan in the question window and make sure it hasn't already been asked. That just makes things a little bit easier for us. Do stick around at the end. Like I said, we will do the Q&A. And for any questions not answered, go to our developer forums, developer.salesforce.com/forums. This is our agenda. We'll do a quick intro and overview. We'll then talk about integration dependencies. We'll then talk about basic data and CRUD integration. Then we'll go through Salesforce Connect, Apex integration services, and we have way too much to talk about in integration to cover in one single webinar. That's why this is actually not just one webinar. It's going to be a series of integration webinars. So come back and check out some of those other topics then. And just to set expectations on who I am imagining is on the other side of this webinar, I do expect that people on the call are going to have some experience with integration and use of APIs. I also expect that people are going to be fairly new to Salesforce, if not completely new, and that's where we're aiming this for. If you're an experienced Salesforce developer, I expect most of what I'm going to talk about isn't going to surprise you. It's going to be fairly well-known stuff to you. Do feel free to stick around, though, if you're listening. Certainly we welcome that. All right, so a little bit of introduction. When we think about what a platform is, Salesforce certainly has an application platform. App Cloud allows us to build both internal employee-facing applications, external customer-facing applications. But beyond just being able to build an application, what actually makes it a platform? Well, we think really it's the APIs that matter, right? So it's great if we can build those apps, but if we can't get other apps to talk to our platform, and if we can't have other systems talk to our platform, it's not really much of a platform in the context of enterprise software. So integration is at the linchpin of almost every project of any size in Salesforce. Now, this is just kind of a little diagram to give an overview of what integration looks like. At the top, you can see that connecting to Salesforce, we're going to have apps, we're going to have devices, we're going to have middleware services, perhaps. Those services are probably going to be using different SDKs and toolkits, third-party adapters that have been developed by our partners and our community. Inside of Salesforce, when we're talking about business integration, there are kind of two core use cases for that. The first is I'm integrating with data. The other is kind of business logic integration. So in the first instance, we're integrating either directly and calling to or updating Salesforce data. Perhaps we're connecting Salesforce to other data, or perhaps we're doing something like a push type of channel, which is our streaming API, which allows us to push events out over a channel that says something has changed in Salesforce without having to continuously pull Salesforce. And on the business logic side, this could be something sort of in process when your users are doing something, ensuring that those activities can then be registered or communicated with external systems. So those are kind of the places where, or the basic core use cases of integration in Salesforce. And these types of integrations can either be connecting your external systems to Salesforce data, or connecting Salesforce to your external systems data. And those can fit both the data or the business logic type integration. Now, a few things about sort of the Salesforce API implementation. What does it look like? The first really important thing to understand is that we use a versioned architecture. So every time you integrate with Salesforce, you're integrating a particular version of our API. It's currently version 37. In about a month or so, we're going to drop version 38 because we release new versions with every major Salesforce release 3 times per year. We try and use as much as possible current standards and common architectural patterns. So some common standards that we support are things like SOAP and Bayou, and like a common architectural pattern would be something like REST, of course. And one thing that we try and do is when you update your schema, your object model in your Salesforce environment, we will automatically reflect that in our core standard API. So in our SOAP API, REST API, in our reflection API that allows you to introspect the schema of your environment, and in the push-based streaming API. All of those APIs will update automatically based on schema changes without you having to write a line of code. Okay, so those are some core things about implementation of our APIs. And you also might want to know what are some of the tools that you would use. And certainly common tools like Postman and curl would be available to you. But there are a couple of bespoke tools for Salesforce. The one I'm going to use mostly today is called Workbench. And Workbench is a PHP application. It's an open source application. I'm going to be using a public implementation of that that's hosted by Salesforce developers. You can also take that same PHP application, host it internally, if you want to use an on-premise implementation of the Workbench. There is also something called Force CLI, which I'll mention here, but we've just announced end of life for Force CLI, I think literally yesterday. So just be aware that that's going to be going away. We're going to be replacing it with a new set of command line tools that are going to be launched at Dreamforce. All right, so just a quick look at the Workbench application. All right, so actually this is the environment I'm going to be using today. This is part of our Dreamhouse sample application we've been building for a while. So you can see that it's kind of like a property management type application. We have some properties for sale here. We can go and search for different ones, et cetera, okay? Now, I'm actually going to be connecting to that also with the Workbench tool. And you can see that it actually goes through a little OAuth flow. Now, I've already authenticated and gone through the OAuth flow and authorized this app for my org, so you're not going to see every part of the OAuth flow. But I'll go ahead and log in here. You can see it's looking for current and known Salesforce identities. There we go. And then again, no authorization part of the flow. It's already done that. And you can see that this is it. Just some basic things here. I can see some information about my session. So who am I? How have I connected to this particular org? There's my email address if you want to email me. I actually don't mind. Hopefully I won't get 200 emails right now. I can see what endpoint I'm hitting for this particular call, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's a bunch of things in here, like if I want to do queries and searches, if I want to do basic just data manipulation, if I want to migrate functionality. The main tool I'm going to be using is the REST Explorer here. And the REST Explorer is nice because I can just make a request against the basic endpoint. There's that versioned endpoint that I talked about. And I can get a sense for what are all of the different endpoints that are hanging off of this. And the main ones we're going to be playing around with are S objects here. That's our entities. It's basically a big, long list of our entities. And as you can see, there are a whole lot of things in here, but including custom entities. And I didn't have to write any code to make that custom entity appear in there. Okay? So that is the Workbench tool. I'm going to be doing a lot more with that, but just to give you a little sense for how that works, I put in my URL or my endpoint. I identify what HTTP method to use. If I'm going to do a post or a patch, I can put in a request body, and I'm off and running. Okay. And I mentioned this is an open source project. It is developed by members of our R&D department, but still as an open, free bit of software. If you're interested, you can go and get it from this particular GitHub repo right here. That's where it is maintained. All right. So let's get back to the slides. So what are some dependencies on integration? And I think these are really important things to talk about. There's some things you really must know about the platform at a very minimum level in order to really be effective. So things like your user, authorization, security, SOCL and SOCL, and then how do things change on the platform? So things like Apex and declarative customization. And I'm going to give a very high-level overview of all of these. I am giving this basically as a laundry list of things for you to do research on as you start to build your integration. Okay? So first of all, when it comes to identity, it basically boils down to who is your user, what's that user's profile, and what license does that user have. The user is assigned to the individual. The profile is a group of settings that apply to that user. Some of them are permissions-based. Some of them affect user interface. Some of them affect other things. And your license is essentially what you pay for. So and that's hooked to the profile. So when I create a user that has a profile, the license dictates how much you're essentially paying for that user. And that's important because if you're going to plan out an integration, you need to be a little bit choosy about how many users, like service users or API users, you set up because of that license cost. So just bear that in mind. Most of the time you're going to authorize over OAuth, but there's some other options as well. So things like signed certificates, that's an option in certain instances. So moving on. Security. When you log in, your profile essentially determines the access that you're going to have. And I'm going to focus at it from an entity and a data standpoint, but it does also affect certain things like whitelisted URLs potentially, hours of access, and that kind of thing. So it is more than just the data here that I'm talking about, where I have an entity called broker, for instance. And my broker entity has certain fields in there. My profile is going to say whether a given user, whether me as a user entity at all, and if I can access the entity, which fields I will and won't have access to, and that could be read-only access or edit access. In addition to that, and your profile is a fairly stable configuration, right? You actually have to go in and change metadata to change how the profile works. However, sharing is a little bit different, and sharing is what determines which records your user is going to have access to. This is much more dynamic because a lot of this is based on who's the owner of the record, certain data attributes in the record can affect it. So this is where things can get rather complex on data access. Now, we have ways of opening this up for your API users. So if you're doing kind of a service-based integration where you just need to get all of the data and it doesn't really matter what the user who owns it is. We have ways of configuring the profile to make that easy. Or if you're building like an app where you do need to be very respectful of user access, then again, you can configure the profile to behave that way. So you have a lot of flexibility as far as configuring your security and your access. We have two different ways of getting to the data language-wise. These are two different DSLs, basically. One is a lot like SQL. We call it SOQL for Salesforce Object Query Language. And you can see there that top snippet is doing a select. We're passing in some field names. We can actually get related field names, so we can kind of traverse relationships that way. We're saying what the entity is, and we pass in a where clause. And there are other common bits of syntax if you used SQL, like order by clauses and limits clauses and that sort of thing. Now, SOSL is a little bit different. You can see here where I'm doing find GU19 star, returning account and property. So this is actually a full-text search using a full-text search engine, and it's using only text-based fields and documents. Right. So this is really flexible. You can see that you can search multiple unrelated entities at one time. So this one I can do related entities up at the top with SOQL, unrelated entities with SOSL. And in general, as a rule of thumb, if you're going to be building integration that's doing a lot of text searching, SOSL is a good alternative for avoiding where clauses with likes and wildcards, which don't perform very well. And SOSL and oftentimes can give you much better performance on those. So just to kind of give you an idea where to use which one, that's kind of a good rule of thumb. And of course, customization happens a lot in Salesforce environments. So there are things you can do in Apex code, there are things in custom declarative logic, there are changes in entities and that sort of thing. So just be aware, things can change in that environment. Just good to know. Okay, and I thought I'd just do a quick demo for why I think this is really important for people to understand this. And if I go back to my REST Explorer here, and I'm going to go to my broker object. There we go. And you can see that it's come up with a list of URLs that I can use. And the one that I want to actually get is the broker describe right here. Okay? This is going to give me an introspection of what is the shape of this particular entity, including what are the fields. So you can see here there's fields that correspond to my broker data. If I go back here, I can look at what those brokers look like in the user interface. There we go. So there's Caroline Kingsley, for instance. Now, if I go into setup, one thing that I might decide to do is change the permissions, right? So let's go into my user here, and we'll find me. There I am. And I'm going to go and see that that's the profile of system administrator, so I'm going to go in there. And then I'm going to go and find my field level security for broker. And let's say we're going to treat email as very sensitive information, and we don't want system administrators to have access to emails for our brokers. So we turn off the field access for that, right? That's what I'm doing right here. And if you're not following, it's okay. Just let it wash over you. Take it in. I'm trying to describe what I'm doing. So there we go. So I've now disabled the email field for the system administrator. I'll save that. And if I go back to my workbench here and I re-execute my describe call, let's take a look. Fields. You'll notice that email has disappeared. It's as if it doesn't exist to this user with this profile. So that's why I think that list of things that I put out there, some of them are quite dense as far as getting your head around, especially things like the sharing security model. But it's really good to understand them, at least at a fundamental level, so that if things aren't working in your integration, as you're building your integration, you have a sense for why that might be. Okay, so hopefully that makes the point. You can be the judges of that. There we go. Let me go and turn back on email, because that might be nice to have. And we'll just go right back out here. Okay. Now, let's talk about data and CRUD APIs. All right. Now, the two core ones of these are the REST API and the SOAP API. And traditionally speaking, we talked about the REST API as being the sort of app client API. That's really what it was designed for. And it grew up around the time that REST APIs and REST-based resources were also growing up. The SOAP API is much more venerable, shall we say. It's been around for probably 12, 13 years now. It is a SOAP-based API, so much more complex, but you do have things like WSDL tools to help you generate subclasses and that sort of thing. There's actually a third one that is a CRUD-based API that I don't have listed here, I realize, and that's the bulk API. So you can kind of tuck that one away as well, but bulk API is really for large data integrations, and you might need that, so just be aware of that. As I mentioned, as you create new entities, we automatically generate the endpoints for those. So you can see here that these are some of the endpoints for standard, the standard object called account. And this is the custom entity called property. And you can see that basically the same endpoints are going to exist. The only difference might be things like which fields are available for which entity. So the actual endpoints that we create, whether it's for SOAP, REST, or bulk, are going to be very, very similar. They're going to be very, very similar, if not identical, between different data entities. Okay, so I don't want to talk too much about the REST API. I really, what I want to do is spend some time kind of exploring it with you. So let's jump in and take a look. So I'm going to go back to the workbench here. And the first thing I'm going to do is go back up, and I'm going to go right back up to the version endpoint. And let's take a look at an endpoint called query. There it is. And you can see that right next to it, there's a little link called sample. If I do that, it's going to dump a little query of user of me. So there I am. See? Peter Chicken. So that's all well and good. Okay. But I can use the same endpoint to query any object, in fact. So I'm just going to slide over here. Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Let me grab my links, actually. Okay. I've already done that one. What I need is that one. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit more complex here. So Control A, paste it in, and execute. And what did I do wrong? That's what I did wrong. I have a whole bunch of spaces in there, creating a malformed query. There we go. That looks much, much better. Now, I'm going to show you what the data looks like, and I'm going to step back and show you what the query looks like. So I have a list of records here, and you'll notice that in addition to the fields that I queried, I'm also getting related properties, right? So for every broker, what properties are associated with them, I get to see those as well. So let's actually break down what this query is doing. Oh, I know why it didn't behave well. That makes sense. So I'm going to open up an Atom window here and paste my query in. And what you'll notice is, actually, I'm going to do it this way with the from. Okay, so there's my endpoint, blah, blah, blah. That's all fine. There's my queue parameter. I'm just going to get rid of that because what really matters is my query. Select ID name email, comma, and then in brackets, select ID name from properties __r. this is also traversing a relationship. So I showed you earlier just kind of a text-based example of traversing a relationship to a parent record. Here, I'm actually traversing a relationship to child records. So this is one of the ways that we give you to optimize your queries. If you know you need to go and get a certain number of records and their child records, you can actually build that into one single query of your data. So really useful little feature there, and just something to be aware of. And this is, again, SOCL. So as we talked about. So let's move on to, let's go back to our URL here. Now what you'll notice is if I go in and dig into some of these, there's also a link to the child record, so I can go and jump directly into that. And making a GET request to that particular URL, right, that's going to get me all of the fields for that particular record. I can pass in as a query parameter a list of just the fields that I want to, so that's an option as well. In this case, I'm just going to get everything if I don't pass any parameters in. Okay. So, so that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the ways we can get some data. Now I'm going to go back up and so I'm going to paste back in my same query from before and execute that. And instead this time I'm going to jump to Caroline Kingsley. Okay. Now let's say with Caroline Kingsley I want to update some data. Again, fairly straightforward stuff here. I'm just going to pop in a little JSON object. Oh, and in fact, I should have this. There we go. Let's make it easy for myself. Last thing you want to do is watch somebody typing JSON into a window. So there's my data there, and you can see I'm just going to take the mobile number, the phone number. I'm actually going to patch for an update. Post is insert. And that should be good to go. Oh, that always looks good. Now, one of the things, though, is patch actually doesn't return anything to me. In order to do that, I would need to go back and repeat that request, but with a GET to that same endpoint. And then you can see, there we go. So I have those updated values in there. I've added a country code, and I've corrected the phone number there. So that's all well and good. One of the things that we found is that the REST API was getting very chatty. There were lots and lots and lots of requests being made, and we thought there are probably some ways that we can optimize this. So recently, one of the things we added was we added a feature to bulk together or to batch together REST requests. So let me go and get the URLs for that. All right, and I'm going to just pop that in there. And that's going to be a post. And I need to go and get my JSON package. There we go. And pop that in there. And let's actually break this down and see what this is doing. So what you can see is that the main parameter here is batch request. So that's the main data element in this JSON. And then I have an array. And each array is a subsequent HTTP request using the REST API. So I patch to the same endpoint, and then I do a GET, and I'm going to get back the data. So what that should end up with is I basically do those same two calls, but in one single request to the API. So I'll do execute, and no errors. That's always a good thing. The first one, I get status back with the result no, and then a status with my result and with the updated phone numbers back to the way they were in the first place. So there you go. So that's actually a relatively new feature in our API, which is this ability to batch together multiple APIs sort of arbitrarily. Okay? Excellent. Now, let's look at one other version of sort of batched together APIs. And what if I have a whole bunch of data that I just want to dump in with the REST API? There's another endpoint that's called treat. And yes, of course, I have the endpoint to paste in there. So I'll go and grab my, oops, I don't want the URL bit. That would be bad. Okay. There we go. And again, I'll go and grab my JSON, of which there's a lot. And I may actually just do that in this window here, just to kind of break it down. It's a little bit bigger. I'll first paste it in. Okay. So what is this thing doing? This is doing a tree insert of records. So whatever my endpoint is here, broker, my top level records all have to match that entity type. So they're all brokers. And then I can put in as many of those up as I want to, up to 200. Or if I also want to, I can do child records. So remember I queried the parent and child records. Here I'm going to insert parent and child records. And the nice thing is I don't need to insert the parents, insert the children, get back their IDs, parcel those out to the parents, and then insert the parents in 2 separate requests and a lot of work. I simply grab that all up, put it all into one JSON structure, and dump it in there. And you can see that there's where that's going, okay? So there's my first property there. It's called Bagshot Park, and the second one is 30 Waterers Way. All right, so let's go back to the workbench, and we'll execute that. Oh, it's always a good day when you see has errors false. And our result is that we have our responses. And this reference ID is an arbitrary ID that I can pass in. So I just kind of passed in some characters that I threw into my JSON. But normally this would be sort of a local identifier if there's a local system of record that you can then reconcile with this data. And then we can go back and look in Salesforce, and I can do a little refresh here, and I can see there's 30 Waterers Way in Bagshot Park. I don't really have any pictures for, oh, that's not bad, that's not good. I don't have any pictures for those, which could be why it's complaining. And then back here, I have my brokers. There's my Robert Callahan broker, and I'm just using the plain old chatter image file there. Okay, so isn't that exciting? I think it is. I think it really simplifies the ability to use the REST API. So let's continue. Now, one thing I'll mention before we go on to the next topic is probably you're going to want to use a toolkit, right? Some of these we actually do. So, for instance, the Java Web Services Connector is a long-standing tool that we put together. There's a NuGet package if you're going to do like a .NET integration using Visual Studio. There's also mobile SDK for both iOS and Android. So there are a lot of options that you have to do integration if you don't want to do the raw URL calls yourself for the REST API. So bear that in mind. Next thing I want to talk about is Salesforce Connect. So we're switching here now. Up to this point, I've been talking about how you get to the Salesforce data from an external system. Now we're going to talk about how do you wire up Salesforce to an external system, right? So how do I essentially take data from an external system and then make it behave as if it is sort of native data in Salesforce. And this used to be a lot more complicated. It took a lot of writing of Apex and that sort of thing. We've now introduced something called Salesforce Connect, which is support for OData 2.0 or 4.0. And if you don't have an endpoint that supports either of those protocols, you can actually write a custom connector using Apex. And last thing, there's also Connect features that work for Salesforce org to Salesforce org. There are features with this that also are kind of related to that, like Files Connect and Heroku Connect. Now, what ends up happening in Salesforce, though, is the external data gets represented as a proper Salesforce entity or a Salesforce object. So you can introspect the schema of the system of record. You can automatically generate Salesforce objects. There's no data duplication. We go and get the data on request, and the data remains mastered at the system of record. Now, there's a straight kind of integration that we can do with this. A lot of vendors these days support OData as a standard. On the other hand, maybe you're in a more complex environment where you don't have just one ERP system. You have 2 or 3 or 4 of them, and you might have middleware to federate those, and then you can have the middleware present an OData endpoint. So that's an alternative as well. All right, let's take a look at Salesforce Connect. I'm going to go back into Setup now. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look for external data sources. There it is, external data sources. And in here you can see I've already created this one called OrderDB. So maybe in our property management app, we want to be able to go and see payments that have been made. And so I'm going to go to this OrderDB external data source. And I'm going to click on validate. Oh, looks like I've already validated and synced payments. I meant to delete that. Oh, you know what I did is let's see if this is actually active anymore. Ah, it is, okay. So let's go back. All right. So the process of validating and syncing, I'll show this with another entity. Is I go in here, I do validate and sync, and then I can pick the entity that I want to from that external system. I select that, I do sync. If the external system supports it, then it will tell Salesforce what those entities look like, and then it automatically creates that entity. So it is a new connection to an external system with point-and-click functionality. It's fairly straightforward. Now, this particular integration, we're doing that as a simple read-only integration. With OData 4.0, you get read-write integration. So I'm going to go back to payments here. And what you can see is this is an entity. If you've ever seen a Salesforce object page, it looks just the same. The only real difference is that there are some parameters that are slightly different. There's an external data source, and the API name has this __x on it. So just be aware that the name is slightly different. But once it's there, we can build it into the Salesforce UI without any code. So let me go and do that. Let's go and find tabs. There we go. I'll do a new custom tab. There's my payments object. And I'll select next. I'll identify who's going to actually see this tab and do next. And then in the old app picker, whether they're going to show up associated with a particular app. And in the new app central, the app launcher, it would be under there. So I'll do save. And there we go. So there's my bank entity and bank tab. And the final thing I need to do is actually add it to a navigation menu. So this little menu I have here on the left is a custom navigation menu. And I simply have to go in here and click on Edit. I don't need to change anything about the name or the description. I just need to go and find my new tab. And there it is, Payments. I'll move it over. I'll do Next. I'll identify it just as my profile for now, System Administrator. And now the one thing I have to do is that in Lightning Experience, the only thing that updates this menu is actually relaunching the UI. So I'm just going to go here and hit Enter. That's actually going to restart the whole Aura framework and Lightning framework. And there's my Payments tab. It doesn't look like there's any data, but I just have to go to All. And right now it just has some kind of default field. So if I were to go in and I would select the fields to display and then maybe pick some new ones and get rid of some ugly ones. So display URL we don't need, but some of these other ones might be interesting. Undo that one, move that over, and save, and then we should see some hopefully meaningful data. There we go. All right, now I'm going to leave it at this very basic level, showing the actual bringing in of an object, but there are point-and-click ways to actually create relationships between this object and other external objects or standard Salesforce objects or other custom objects. So if you've ever built an object with a relationship, there are a few more steps with external objects, but you basically do the exact same thing. Okay, so in the instance where you want to make a request to an external system, you would do that using these three classes. The first one is HTTP request, so we create an instance of that. We set information about the request, so things like the endpoint, the HTTP method we're going to use, the body, headers, anything like that you need to. We then create a new instance of the HTTP class, which we use to pass in the request, and then hopefully get our response. Or, well, we'll get a response, but hopefully a 200 response of some sort or another. So there's certainly a lot of other things that need to happen because you need to create the request. You probably have data that's going to come that you're going to pass in. You need to marshal up, need to unmarshal the data from the response itself, and then deal with that inside of Apex. But at the bottom of any call out to an external system, this is the way that you're going to do that. There are also some additional classes for making SOAP requests too. Now, if I'm going to surface an external API, however, it's going to look something like this. So here I've identified that this global class is going to be a REST resource. What is the actual URL going to be? And then I've defined a method here that is going to be invoked using HTTP GET. And you can see that I also have a REST request and a REST response context object. And so REST request, for instance, could be where I could go and get things like the parameters from the URL and the actual path that was requested. And just to show that really quickly, let me hop on here. And in this instance, there we go. Let's take a look at the Slack integration. So I'm in here. This is a Slack channel I've created for doing demos. And you can see that there's some posts being made out here from some previous playing around with this. I'm going to go and find a property. And what I've done is I've created a rule that says when a property is set to sold, oh, there's a little error again, it's going to trigger a little process. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll say sold and save. And with any luck, there we go. So the following property is changed, bag shop part, new status, sold. Okay. So how did we do that? I'm going to go back into setup. This is actually a combination of some point-and-click customization and some programmatic customization. So there is an Apex class that's doing the call-out, but the actual invoking of the Apex class has been delegated to something that an administrator can build. So first I'm going to look at Process Builder. There it is. And this one is post property status change to Slack. So we'll go and take a look at that. So it's linked to the property entity. If the status is sold, then we can see that I'm going and finding this Slack pub class and passing in some variables and invoking the method. Okay, so and the action is actually called post status change to Slack. That's actually a label that I've assigned to a method. So let's go and look at that class and that method, and here it is. So I've set up two constants, one for my endpoint and the other, which is the message template that I'm going to format. Those are the parameters that I set that you saw. So each of those is set up as an actual variable that I'm going to set. And then to actually make that happen, or the actual method that I'm going to invoke is this post to Slack. And I'm going to pass in records. I get the first one of those. And then I invoke this little helper method. It unmarshals the actual record and puts it into a list string so that I can pass that into string.format. I then put that into a map, serialize that into JSON, and pass that in as the body of what I'm going to actually post to Slack. There's my URL and the method post. Now, the actual engine for this is down here. It's actually using a queuable class. And queuable just means that it can be done asynchronously. Queuable classes can also be sort of organized and reordered, and there's some other things that you can do with them. But it's one of the ways of asynchronously invoking some functionality, which is usually advisable if you're going to be invoking the external web service. So there we go. There's my HTTP request that we saw earlier. I set some information. There's the HTTP class, and there's my response. And that's pretty much it. So there's a little example of some Apex for integration. And with that, that pretty much wraps up all of the main bits that I wanted to cover. So just a brief roundup of a few other topics that I think are going to be very important for you to understand. The first one is the streaming API. I love talking about the streaming API. I love demoing the streaming API. It's a lot of fun. It does use long polling and Bayou protocol in order to affect a push-based model and a pub-sub type integration model. So it's not true push-based integration, but it is the best we can do. We do not implement WebSockets, and from what I understand, there are some implementation concerns about getting that to work in a multi-tenant environment specifically. One thing about the streaming API that's relatively a new development is that it's replayable. So now I have to make sure that I do this in my client, but if a client does disconnect and it's tracking the message index, it can automatically reconnect and get all messages after the last one that it actually was able to process. So it used to be that the streaming API would drop messages if you disconnected potentially. That's something we've actually fixed now. So next thing is outbound messages. So this is actually another way of pushing out data changes to external systems. It's invoked by a declarative rule, and there's actually no code on the Salesforce side to make this happen. It's almost like a webhook in its implementation. The only problem is that it uses a SOAP message instead of a traditional webhook type of interface. Another nice thing about the outbound message feature is that it is queued and retried if necessary. So if for some reason the sending of the message failed, Salesforce will recognize that it didn't get a response from the client, and it will automatically retry that. You don't have to make the client do the work on that side. Lightning Out is another interesting integration story, and this little screenshot here shows Office 365, so this is Outlook 365, with a little Lightning component embedded in an email message. So Lightning Out allows us to take Lightning components and stick them into any web container at all. Now there's a little bit of work getting that done. You do still have to authorize. You have to have a user. So there's, it's not just plop it in there, but it does make it possible to build your user interface using Lightning components and then actually see it pretty much anywhere on the web. Canvas API is another interesting one. In Lightning components, you're taking the Salesforce user interface and you're surfacing it in another application. With the Canvas API, you take another application and you service it into the Salesforce user interface. And there's a whole SDK involved in this. Basically, you implement some JavaScript functionality in your client application. It then uses or works with a Visualforce page or a Lightning component to then surface your external application inside of the Salesforce user interface. So you have kind of the external app on the left-hand side, and you have the Salesforce UI on the other side, and it sort of come up with this mashup that is authenticated. And the nice thing is you can take actions in the external application that will then make requests over the API back to Salesforce to update data in Salesforce. So it creates a virtually seamless UI integration between external applications and Salesforce on the UI layer. All right, and that pretty much wraps up the things I wanted to cover for today. Like I said, there's tons more to cover in integration. This was really just an overview and a survey of a bunch of topics. Hopefully you got a little bit of a taste of the most important ones, things like the CRUD-based APIs for SOAP, for REST, and for bulk. A little bit of information about tools like the Workbench. Hopefully you also were able to digest some information about Salesforce Connect, as well as the Apex integration services, and you have a few ideas of where to go next. Now, Dreamforce is coming up. Those of you who are coming, we really look forward to seeing you there. We're going to be on the ground floor of Moscone West, so it's a little bit different from previous years. Can't wait to see you. It's going to be a great 4 days of Salesforce onslaught. And now it's time for the Q&A. So make sure, if I don't answer your questions, make sure you post them in the developer forums. So I'm going to actually break out of the slides for a second. And somewhere over here, I should have all the questions that Mark has been collecting from you kind people. All right. So, is it enough to provide a user that will only have API access with a Salesforce platform license? So yes and no. The Salesforce platform license will give you access to any custom objects that you create. It will also give you access to certain standard objects. Standard objects that are included are things like account and contact. But anything that is considered pure CRM, so things like opportunities, leads, I think those are the main ones, opportunities and leads, you will not see those. And actually anything else that's related to CRM, quotes probably, you won't see those with a platform license user. You won't even have the option to grant access to those objects. So if it's a platform-only connection, and it doesn't include those CRM objects, you're good to go with the platform license. If you need access to any of those CRM objects, you need the full Salesforce license. Now, we were meant to end at this point in time. We did have a little bit of a delay, and I've gone a little long. So I'm going to continue for about another 5 minutes and answer some questions and do the best I can. So let me go through some of these. If I have to access these APIs outside Workbench through Postman, then how do I mention URL and authentication? That's a very good question. So I've done that before. When I've used Postman, what I'll do is I'll create, you have to create an external application in Salesforce. You then will create and probably save a request to the OAuth endpoint using the username password flow. That will then retrieve a session token, which is actually the session ID, and then you can pass that in the bearer parameter of your requests through Postman. There are other ways to get your session ID. If you have your own hosted version of the Workbench, you can actually get the session ID from there. But we've shut that down in the public hosting of the Workbench because Trust determined that that was potentially a security exploit. So, Peter, I like your hat. Thank you very much. How does Salesforce integrate to enterprise security like firewalls, etc.? Can we talk about this? For example, if Salesforce wants to consume enterprise services. Yes, we do integrations through firewalls. Usually there are some configurations and steps that you have to go through. So oftentimes our customers will have to whitelist certain IP addresses that correspond to the data center for their instance. So that's usually one way to do it. Sometimes customers will roll their own security certificate, so that might be another thing that you have to do. These tend to be very case by case depending on the topography of the actual network and the firewall. So really, the best thing I can suggest is to do some walking around the internet, check out the developer forums, check out Stack Exchange, and find out who else is doing something similar to your firewall configuration, and you should find some help there. There are also some security best practices documents that I would look for in the architecture library on the developer website. Why do we want to use the SOAP API since we have less complex REST API? It is also faster than SOAP API. Is there any data transaction limit? So it's two questions, really. Honestly, I can't think why you'd want to use the SOAP API, but it just doesn't seem right having an integration talk without mentioning that we support it, and we do it pretty well. The SOAP API does also have some features that correspond a little bit better to more typical enterprise integration. So in some cases, if you're doing a more machine-to-machine based integration, SOAP API might be a slightly better thing to use. On the other hand, and the REST API has only recently supported batch-based saving of data, and so that might be another reason why you might choose the SOAP API. There are data transaction limits. There's kind of a generic API limit that corresponds to most sort of basic either data or metadata API requests, and that is usually a certain number of transactions per day per user for your production org. There are certain APIs that have special limits. So for instance, the streaming API, because it doesn't use a traditional request response type of connection, it uses a slightly different set of limits. So in general, it'll be a transaction per 24-hour limit, but certain APIs will have some special limits as well. Where am I getting the query for use in Workbench? That's a really good question, and we're coming up on that 5 minutes, and there's a little feature that I think I'll just show as a way to wrap up. We have lots and lots more questions that are very good questions. I just am not going to have time to answer them. But since the question often comes up, how do I query? Maybe I'll show you. Does that sound like fun? I think it's going to be fun. So I'm actually going to go back here to Workbench, and I'm going to show my screen first. Thank you, Mark, for helping me out with that. I have often been doing a webinar and started talking about my screen without showing it. So let me go in here, and I'm going to actually open an object. You can do that, and in my instance, maybe I'll do the broker object. So let's find broker __ C. There it is, and open. Now, if you'll notice down below here, there's a little button called Query. I just noticed this about 6 months ago and was really blown away that I could do this. So I'll just select a few things, and we'll say name, and we'll do a few of the custom fields, maybe all of them, and maybe we'll say created by ID just for good fun. And I'll select Query, and you'll notice it's actually constructed the query down here in the query editor. I can then click execute, and then it goes in and does that. And I can very handily take this guy, copy it, and then I can go and use it wherever else that I want to. So how do you construct a query? I think this is the easiest, most readily available tool right now. There are some other tools out there that will let you build it. The Workbench also has a tool that will help you do it as well. Probably a good idea to show that. So let me go back here. Workbench. If I go to queries, SOCL query, it's timed me out. Workbench likes to do that. There we go. I can do kind of the same thing. So again, I'll go and find broker. There we go. It actually gives me this one, which is a select count, if I just want to know how many. It would return 10 records. Isn't that exciting? So let me undo count, and I'm just going to do all the other ones and do query. And isn't that exciting? So I can then, again, take this, and then I can go and pull it into my REST API if I want to. Execute, and I should be good to go, provided I've only selected queryable fields. Yes, isn't that exciting? So there we go. So just a couple of different ways that you can go about constructing your query without having to hand type it all in. And I think that's where we're going to wrap it up. So apologies, a little technical problem that caused us to run over, also, or at least reduced our amount of Q&A time. Hopefully you found this webinar useful. We have recorded it. It's going to be in 2 parts, so we'll see how well we can blend those together seamlessly to make it appear as nothing ever happened with my audio. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Should I put up the big thank you slide? Yes, there it is. Thank you, writ large. Really appreciate it. Do engage with us on social media. Go out there, get with us on Twitter, go to the developer forums. Look forward to seeing you, and happy coding. Thank you.